so when you graduated from UT, where did your path go from there?
Let's see. So when I graduated from UT, that's really funny because a lot of this is, I see things have changed so much because of the internet and social media. Like,
right.
The way people are in their 20s now is so different from the way, and I don't want to date myself, but
we're roughly the same age, so I totally get what you're saying.
So I don't want to say I was not ambitious, but I don't think I was aware of the level of people travel so much and they're doing all these projects and things. And for me, ambition was just like, okay, I got to now go live by myself somewhere. So at the time, my boyfriend and I got in a car. We drove to San Francisco. And I lived in San Francisco for a while, and I worked with friends through some animation studios and, had a few shows out there. I was just kind of freelancing. I worked with a guy who had I think it was called special effects or art effects or something, and we would make, murals and just all kinds of things for, cafes and restaurants. And it was that kind of, but it was just, I just needed that experience of like, okay, now can I try to work?
Right.
And, learn how to live on my own and all that. I mean, I was living on my own at UT with roommates, but this is sort of like that rite of passage of like, you get your own apartment and you're, So I did that for a few years and actually, and it was a good experience, but San Francisco is a tough town. It's very transient and unless you really committed to staying there, it's, it takes a long time to kind of build community.
Right.
And I've just had this weird relationship with Texas because I had people offering me jobs here while I was out there trying to hustle and work hard. And I'd have people be like, hey, if you want to come work for us here.
Right.
So eventually I came back. Now my first kind of grown-up job, I guess I could say, with a salary and all that was with the Office of Cultural Affairs here at the city of Dallas. And my job was to help develop arts in Oak Cliff. So getting pulled back to Oak Cliff. We had a space that's still there. It's called the Ice House Cultural Center. And it was sort of the forerunner or the predecessor to the Oak Cliff Cultural Center that's next to the Texas Theater now.
Right.
But I worked with a friend of mine, Yolanda, and we had to create our own nonprofit to sort of for the city to contract through so that we could lease this private space. But it was an incubator for a lot of what you were saying, a lot of artists who lived in Oak Cliff who, they didn't have the sort of resources or information to like be in big galleries and things like that. So we opened that center up to kind of promote arts, really at ground zero here.
So you went to work for the Office of Cultural Affairs, and then you guys identified that need and kind of splintered off that part to be able to get the funds from the city to be able to meet that need. Is that sort of?
So you're kind of, you're like getting deep in this thing. What, to be honest with you, Dallas, every city is its own sort of, has its own sort of culture of things that are going on locally, but they're also part of this like zeitgeist, right? And what was happening in now we're talking like the 90s, sort of late 90s, was the cultural wars everywhere in the United States, where really there was this, and it's not over in some ways, like this kind of really important battle where demographically you have all these people who are not represented in the arts. And so there was a lot of advocacy going on and a lot of agitation around that. And I think it's the forerunner of a lot of, that are now institutions like Mexicarte in Austin and things like that. So the city knew, the Office of Cultural Affairs at the time, roughly around the same time, Dallas went from being at large to the 1041 or something, like they redesigned the mayor and the city council and all that to have more representation, and so that there was a need in Oak Cliff, and the Office of Cultural Affairs kind of recognized that and was trying to do sort of a seeded project, and that was a way to sort of work that out. So,
okay.
So it was driven from both sides, in
Got
part
it.
from the artists, and then in part from the city management.
Sure.
So, yeah.
And so was that? I think I hear something in there that maybe it was meeting cultural needs, specific to like a Latino community.
Principally in Oak Cliff, but everybody benefited from it because actually, and this is where you see how individuals can make a difference.
Right.
Me personally, since I was involved in running it, since I grew up in Mexico City, I always had, it's a funny thing about people, how they perceive Mexico, but it's like, I feel like I did grow up with a very kind of international perspective.
Sure.
I never, had this concept that like Shakespeare is, because he's British, it's European patrimony, and like, Mexicans do Shakespeare all the time, you know?
Right.
So when we did the Ice House, of course we were, helping a lot of Latino groups that were in Oak Cliff, but it was also, frankly, one of the few centers in Oak Cliff that was just open for artists. So we had a lot of other artists coming through that were not Latino who were also using it. We worked with them. I mean, we were open to everybody. And I think that tone, in part, was important to help kind of bridge communities so that there wasn't this perception of like one thing for one group. And, I really
Sure.
don't like that. I've always resisted people who've asked me to be in a show strictly because I'm a Latina or something like that, because I find it strange to think that only only black people will go to black dance theater. Obviously that's not true, but sometimes we get pigeonholed in these kinds of categories of like, this art for this group of people, and we really got to get to the point where we live together and we all need to like support each other's work.
Right.
But in the 90s, that was definitely something that was going on. So, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so after that, so you were there, the Ice House, that development in Oak Cliff. So where did your path go from there?
So at some point, I learned a lot from that job, but I also, this is like I think a challenge for all artists, managing you personally as an artist.
Yes.
And then working.
Right.
And it was really funny because I was like, oh my gosh, I'm becoming an arts, like an arts management person.
Right.
And so I decided to go back to get my MFA.
Okay.
Because it just felt like, I needed the space, and I had applied for some residencies, and I went to do a residency in upstate New York at this, it's in Rosendale, New York, Women's Studio Art Center.
Okay.
And that was really good experience. It was like the dead of winter, and this time I was like, I need to go somewhere where there's 12 feet of snow. So I spent part of a winter there making a lot of more like printmaking stuff. I've always liked working with paper.
That was going to be one of my questions a little bit later. Was what was your art? What did your art look like back then? Where creatively how has that evolved?
Yeah. So from there, I went on to Tyler School of Art, and Tyler School of Art is it has everything, but it's a painting school. It's really good in painting and sculpture, so when I started really, out of high school, I really liked printmaking a lot. And I liked painting, but it's really funny. When I look back at my paintings from really early on, they were collage paintings. I used to paint on wood and add stuff to it. I used to paint on paper and fabric and add stuff to it. I used to cut it up. And a lot of that, I think, came out of my work back full circle to theater and film. Honestly, like it's my earliest paintings were very figurative, and they were kind of narrative. And there was definitely a sense of characters in them. And a lot of almost what I would say are like vaudevillian accoutrements. Like I would stick, beads on, and like I was really influenced by these banners that are made in Haiti. In Haiti, they're like processional banners that they use during ceremonies, and so they will have the depictions of like the orishas and the gods and goddesses, but they also have a lot of almost like carnivalesque like sequins and fringe. And so I started going to the fabric store, which it's like a theater run, like a prop run. So I'd go to the fabric store, and I was really attracted for a while to these kind of prints on that they use for quilting. They're like plaids, like really small checks, and I liked them. One, they reminded me a lot of colonial, like turn of the century or antebellum type of what you imagine, like gingham. You know what I'm saying?
Precisely.
But the other thing is they were a grid. And I liked painting on them because they immediately were like this kind of like weird grid that I could, like it was a background without having to create a background. So they're almost like strangely old-fashioned, and at the same time even then looked a little like digital screens because they had that sort of pixelated squares in the back. And so I did a lot of painting on fabric for a while. And when I went to Tyler, I mean, it was really a painting school. And I would get dejected because I was a terrible painter, I realized. Really, truly. I had so many critiques where I was like, I painted very flat, like almost like poster style. Like, and, I had amazing teachers. So I had Stanley Whitney, who's like a fantastic painter, and he'd come in and he'd look at my stuff and he's like, are you trying to be naive? Like, is it trying to be like folk art? Because you're really not a great painter. I mean, I could draw, but I just wasn't. He would call them dumb painters, and I don't think he meant that insulting. He meant that like you just don't think about it. You enjoy the lushness of the painting. Sure. And he's like, your problem is that you think too much. You're not a dumb painter. Like you're thinking a lot about content, and your style is very sort of almost flat graphic. Like I don't even see the point of painting unless you really want it to look like street art. Right. And I loved that. I went to India at one point, and I loved all the hand-painted Bollywood posters and stuff because I kind of liked that weird flatness. Sure. So eventually that turned into what I'm doing now, which was that I realized, like, instead of just painting and cutting up paint, I could cut up pictures of paint. Right. I could cut up art magazines and photographs of things. And in a way, I feel like collage has always been with me. It's, I feel more like a editor, like a film editor, rather than a film director or script writer. And I'm using those film analogies because they're familiar to me, but it's like almost like getting just a bunch of material and cutting
that's really
it
interesting. Now that I hear you kind of talk your way through that makes a lot of sense. That you're taking all, it's almost like you're taking miles of footage and you're choosing, these images and you're putting them together. And, you're making these scenes, right?
Yeah, exactly. So they're not narrative in that sense anymore, but they are. I want there to be, they're abstract, but I also want them to feel like they have movement, like almost like a screen capture or a film still of something that feels almost like it's becoming an object or almost feels like an organism. Right. But it's still also just a jumble of parts. And it's really interesting because I think one of the things, how I think as artists sometimes we respond to things without knowing, and then later on when we step back we start to see some rationale behind it. I I think, indirectly, I'm not a really I love cutting things up and working by hand, and I'm not a really great digital graphic artist type